Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 9 of History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 1, by Henry Charles LEA, Book 2, Chapter 4, Conflicting Jurisdictions, Part 9. Then the affair suddenly assumed another phase. On March 7th the Queen had written to her ambassador in Rome to procure the abstention of the Pope from the matter, but on that very day the Congregation of the Inquisition, with the approval of the Pope, had pronounced invalid the censures fulminated by the Inquisitor. It was late in May before this was communicated to the Queen by the nuncio, who said that the Pope had recognized the gravity of the assault by an inquisitor on the episcopal dignity and the magnitude of the ensuing scandal, and had caused the whole subject to be carefully considered by the Congregation with the above result. The Pope had felt deeply not only the indignity offered to the episcopal office, but also that the fiscal of the Inquisition had applied to the Queen to summon the bishop before it, solely on the ground of his having appealed to the Holy See. In the name of the Pope, the nuncio therefore asked the Queen to order inquisitors not to proceed against bishops and to reject the application of the fiscal. Even this did not shake the determination of Nithard to reduce the episcopate to subjection. A long and argumentative consulta was presented to the Queen, proving that the papal decision was surreptitious and therefore invalid, and that anyhow the decrees of the Roman Inquisition had no currency in Spain. The old prohibitions of appeals to Rome were invoked, and the Queen was told that one of the most precious jewels of the Spanish crown was at stake, for unless the regalias were preserved, the Inquisition must disappear, delinquents would be unpunished, religion would suffer and, with the loss of its unity, there would no longer be obedience to the throne. The Queen was therefore urged to stand firm. The prosecution of the bishop must not be suspended and the Council of Aragon must be forced to obey the royal commands. Nithard was ready to risk an open breach with the Holy See in his audacious ambition to render the Inquisition supreme in the Spanish Church. How far the Queen would have suffered herself to be carried in the execution of his plans cannot be told, as the documents fail us here. His career, however, was drawing to a close. In February 1669 he was driven from Spain amid universal execration, yet the prosecution of Bishop Manjarre was not abandoned, for the Inquisition was not accustomed openly to admit defeat. It dragged until his death, December 26, 1670, when it was quietly dropped. Practically, the intervention of Rome gave the victory to the Mallorquins, of which they took advantage. In 1671 there arose another quarrel over a fine incurred by a canon who was also a consultor of the tribunal. Both sides exchanged excommunications, and Inquisitor-General Valladares, profiting by his predecessor's experience, showed moderation. On the plea that it was a matter of government rather than of jurisdiction, the Suprema ordered the tribunal to abandon the case and remove the censures imposed on the canons, but the latter were not content with this and procured from the Roman Holy Office a decree declaring invalid the censures of the inquisitors and valid those of the executors of the brief. The Council of Aragon communicated this to the Queen, who submissively signed a letter, January 25, 1672, to the chapter, expressing her confidence that in its use they would pay fitting attention to the peace and advantage of the Church. The Inquisition was not accustomed to defeat, and it chafed under this, as was shown when, in 1690, a quarrel arose because a priest of Minorca, named Juan Bruels, used insulting words to the commissioner, Rafael Pons. For this he was prosecuted and the case threw all the islands into confusion. The viceroy, the Audiencia and the clergy all united against the Inquisition. The Ordinary of Minorca, as executor of the brief of 1642, forcibly released Bruels, forbade the inquisitor to proceed and, on his disobeying, excommunicated him. About this time the Mallorquin tribunal had claims to consideration arising from its vigorous proceedings against Judaizers and the large resultant confiscations. The Suprema espoused its cause with the usual energy and, in repeated consultas to Carlos III, denounced the papal briefs as surreptitious and invalid, full of defects and nullities. The feeble king issued repeated commands for the prosecution of Bruels and the surrender of the briefs, but no one paid attention to them. The Mallorquin clergy procured from the Congregation of the Inquisition a decree validating the censures pronounced by the Ordinary and annulling those of the inquisitor. The pope confirmed this but subsequently suspended it at the earnest solicitation of the Spanish ambassador, at the same time ordering his nuncio to make the king understand that the Congregation had supreme power to decide all questions of jurisdiction. The affair did not result to the satisfaction of the Inquisition, for the last we hear of it is a bitter complaint by the Suprema, March 11, 1693, of the contumacious Mallorquins and the miserable condition to which they had reduced the Inquisition. In Minorca the clergy and their dependents were so hostile that Pons could not find a church in which to celebrate mass, while the officials were shunned as excommunicated heretics. Another jurisdiction with which there were occasional quarrels was that of the army, for soldiers were exempt from the secular courts. In such competencias settlements were made by a junta of 2 members, each of the Suprema and the Council of War, with final reference to the king in case of disagreement. I have happened to meet with but few cases of this, and they seem never to have attained the importance of those with the secular and ecclesiastical courts. One occurred in 1629, arising from disputes with the garrison that had occupied Aljaferia since the troubles of 1591. A somewhat curious case was that of Don Fernando Antonio Herrera Calderon of Santander, who was alguazil and familiar and who resigned in 1641 from his military company, although warned that, by so doing during hostilities, he would be tried by the Council of War. It naturally claimed him and the Suprema endeavored to protect him. It would seem that, towards the end of the 18th century, the exemption of the military was causing special troubles, for a royal cedula of February 9, 1793 declares that, to put an end to them, in future the military judges shall have exclusive cognizance of all cases, civil and criminal, in which soldiers are defendants, except inheritances, and that no tribunal or judge of any kind shall form a competencia concerning them under any pretext. There was yet another independent jurisdiction with which the Inquisition occasionally came into collision. In Spain the military orders formed so important a body that, among the state councils, there was one of orders, which had exclusive jurisdiction over their members. It will be recalled that one of Ferdinand's most efficient measures to ensure the peace of the kingdom was to obtain the perpetual administration of those of Santiago, Calatrava and Alcántara, while the queen assumed that of Montesa. Yet he was not disposed to favor their claims of exemption in temporal matters from the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. A letter of September 15, 1515, to the Tribunal of Jaén says that certain confiscations involve property held by knights of the 3 orders who may claim exemption and refuse to plead before the judge of confiscations. If so, they are not to be listened to and, if necessary, are to be prosecuted with the full rigor of the law. In civil and criminal matters the members of the orders asserted exemption from the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, leading to disputes more or less acrimonious. In 1609, at Cordova, Don Diego de Argote, a knight of Santiago, with levelled pistol, prevented the arrest of one of his servants by officials of the tribunal. A competencia resulted which, when carried up to Philip III, was decided by him in favor of the Council of Orders. To this the Suprema replied in a consulta. foretelling the entire destruction of the Inquisition in case the decision was allowed to stand, and so worked on Philip that he reversed his decree and allowed the Suprema to prosecute the culprit. The complication caused by these class privileges is illustrated in the case alluded to above, occurring in 1648 at Cuenca of Muñoz de Castilblanque for the murder of the priest Jacinto. He was a knight of Calatrava, which led to an additional competencia when the junta could not agree and the king had to decide. In their contests with the orders, the tribunals were apt to exhibit the same unscrupulous spirit as in those with other contestants. In Majorca, Dr. Ramon Sureda, canon, chancellor and judge of competencias, was likewise conservator of the military orders. In 1657 he complained that, in conflicts of jurisdiction, the inquisitor would not form competencias with him in order that the papers might take the regular course of transmission for settlement by the Suprema and Council of Orders. The king and queen, therefore, as administrators of the orders, instructed him in such case to send to the inquisitor 3 successive messages and report them and their replies to the council. If, in spite of this, the tribunal continued to prosecute the case, he was to proceed against the inquisitor and the viceroy was to render him all proper support. The inquisitor ingeniously evaded this in the case of Gaspar Puigdorfilio, a knight of Santiago, in 1661, by refusing to receive any messages, saying that he received them only from the viceroy. Sureda's report of this was left unnoticed and the inquisitor adopted the same device in 1662, in the case of Francisco de Vail, a knight of Montesa, prosecuted for wounding a familiar who had drawn a sword upon him. He refused to receive messages and proceeded to sequestrate various property, including his crops and cattle. To save them from destruction, the viceroy interposed and the Council of Orders appealed to the queen, as administrator of the order, to take some action that should enable such questions to be settled peaceably, but apparently without result. As though the exempted classes were not numerous and troublesome enough, there was a project in 1574 of adding another which, if carried into effect, would have altered the destiny of Spain by subjecting it eventually to the Inquisition and reducing the nominal monarch to the position of a roi fainéant under a mayor of the palace. It is a most impressive illustration of the spirit of the age that such a project should have been formulated, that it received enthusiastic support, and that a sovereign so jealous of his prerogative as Philip II should have even allowed it to be debated, much less have let it assume a menacing shape and have given it serious consideration. A military order was to be established under the name of Santa Maria de la Espada Blanca, with a white sword as a symbol, like the red sword of Santiago. At its head was to be the Inquisitor-General, to whom all members were to swear allegiance and whose orders in peace and war all were to obey. To him likewise they were to assign their property, receiving back at his hands what was necessary for their support, and after death their widows were to be pensioned by him. They were to be exempt from all jurisdiction save his, which was to be delegated to priors appointed in all the provinces. The ostensible object was the defence of the faith and of Spain, for which they were at any time liable to be called to the field or to serve in garrison under the orders of the Inquisitor-General. Thus the Inquisition was to be furnished with an organized force, sworn to blind obedience and released from all other obligations. The only requisite for membership was limpieza, or purity of blood, free from all taint of Judaic or Moorish contamination, or descent from those who had been sentenced for heresy. At this period limpieza was becoming a popular mania. The cost of proving it through 4 generations was considerable, and there was strong temptation in the promise that the expenses of all applicants would be defrayed from the common fund. The project may seem to us too wild to merit a thought, but it responded so perfectly to the temper of the time that it was enthusiastically adopted by the provinces of Castile, Leon, Biscay, Navarre, Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia, Asturias and Galicia. Procurators from these provinces submitted it to Philip for his approval, and were supported by representatives of 48 noble houses and of the archiepiscopal sees of Toledo, Santiago, Seville, Saragossa, Valencia, Tarragona and Granada. It was debated earnestly and at much length, but the argument of Pedro Vinegas de Cordova decided its fate. He pointed out the troubles which were already arising on the subject of limpieza, causing jealousies, hatreds and contentions, to be increased enormously if the population was thus to be divided into two classes. Also the fact that the royal courts would have left to their jurisdiction only the New Christians, while the Old Christians would have their special judges, and, if the comparatively few existing familiars caused such all-pervading troubles, what the effect would be of increasing without limit the number of the exempt. On the one hand, the ambitious and able men among the New Christians being thus cast out, would foment disaffection and disturbance. On the other, if the old military orders had been a source of danger to the monarchy, what would be the effect of creating a new one, united and vastly more numerous, and subject as vassals to an Inquisitor-General, whose power was already so great, and who would control the property and have jurisdiction over all members, while in case of rebellion the frontiers and strongholds would be in his hands? This reasoning was unanswerable. Philip ordered all papers connected with the project to be surrendered. He imposed perpetual silence on its advocates, and wrote to the ecclesiastical and secular bodies to abandon it, for justice and protection would never be lacking. We shall probably do no injustice to the Inquisition in attributing to the profits accruing from the exercise of its temporal jurisdiction the ruthless vigor with which the tribunals sought to vindicate and extend it. The remarks of the Visitor Cervantes with regard to Barcelona, in 1561, indicate how lucrative it could be made and how welcome was the addition of fees and fines to the somewhat meagre salaries of the officials. This explains the reckless violence which became habitual in the conduct of quarrels, because this not only was an assurance to the parties concerned as to the vigor with which they were defended, but it also served to discourage the secular authorities from resisting encroachments. It also explains the multiplication of the unsalaried officials such as familiars, commissioners and their notaries, assessors, deputies, etc., which no laws or concordias or regulations could restrain, for each one was a possible source of profit to the tribunal and a probable cause of disturbance in his vicinage, through the comfortable assurance of immunity from the law. The natural result of this was that unprofitable business was neglected for profitable, and the suppression of heresy was postponed to the trial of civil and criminal cases which yielded fees. We have seen how Cervantes reported that in Barcelona this seemed to be the real duty of the tribunal, and that there was nothing else to be attended to. His animadversions produced no amendment and, in 1567, de Soto Salazar repeated the complaint. This continued unchecked. The project of reform presented to the Suprema in 1623 expresses the wish that other tribunals would follow the example of Saragossa, where one of the inquisitors was delegated every 4 months to conduct this business, so that prisoners on trial for heresy could have their cases dispatched and not be kept languishing interminably in prison, which, as we shall see, was one of the sorest abuses inflicted on them. This pious wish was fruitless, and the records of the Inquisition for the following century show how large a portion of its activity was devoted to these cases and to the competencias incessantly springing from them. One feature which aggravated the oppression in these matters, especially in civil suits, was not only the favoritism which inevitably inclined the tribunal to the side of its own people, but the fact that the inquisitors were usually strangers, unfamiliar with the local laws and customs peculiar to each province, which they presumed to interpret and enforce. This justified the frequent demands that inquisitors should be natives, demands which received no attention, for the appointing power thought only of their qualifications as judges of the faith, while to the mass of the population their duties in this respect were of small account in comparison with their activity in their temporal jurisdiction. Another well-grounded source of complaint was that the inquisitorial habits of secrecy could not be wholly overcome. The parties and their counsel were not allowed to be present, as in the royal courts. Witnesses were examined by the inquisitor on lists of interrogatories furnished to him, and there was no cross-examination. Written arguments were presented to him which he handed to the other side for reply, and the procedure in both civil and criminal cases was assimilated as nearly as might be to the secret trials for heresy which was the inquisitorial ideal of the dispensation of justice. The cases were decided by the inquisitors in session together on a majority vote. In the 16th century there was no appeal to the Suprema, even when the vote was not unanimous, but in 1645 a writer assumes that either side could appeal. We have seen how tenaciously the kingdoms of Aragon struggled against the evils of the system. Castile felt them equally, but it had not the same institutions and could only remonstrate. The Cortes of Madrid in 1607–1608 represented that those of 1579 and 1586 had petitioned for the reform of the abuses arising from the temporal jurisdiction of the Inquisition to the great injury of the kingdom, that Philip II had promised relief but had died without granting it, and therefore the request was now repeated in view of the increasing evils. Especially was attention called to the cruelty of imprisoning ordinary offenders, for the people could not distinguish and imagined all prisoners to be heretics, thus entailing infamy upon them and disqualifying them for marriage, wherefore it was asked that they be confined in the public jails. Philip III promised to do what was proper, and of course did nothing. The Cortes of 1611 repeated the petition, with similar lack of result. The Council of Castile, the highest tribunal in the land, in a consulta of 1631, represented forcibly the existing evils, especially the prodigal use of censures under which corregidores and other magistrates lay under excommunication for months together, while individuals were impoverished by the long delays in settling competencias. It urged the remedy of permitting appeals to the council por via de fuerza in cases not of faith, and this it repeated in 1634, 1669 and 1682. More outspoken was a memorial presented in 1648 to Philip by a member of the council on the abuses of the criminal jurisdiction, those in civil cases being treated in a separate paper. The writer alludes to having repeatedly made the same representations orally and in writing. He dwells upon the interminable delays and other obstacles which impede justice and discourage sufferers from seeking it. The resultant immunity creates audacious criminals. The number of familiars and of soldiers who never serve in the field has increased so greatly that nothing is seen but crimes, and the offenders are unpunished. Everywhere men of the most dissolute type and the largest fortunes seek appointment so as to enjoy immunity. The royal revenues are defrauded and prohibited goods are imported, while no corregidor or alcalde dares to curb them, for they are at once excommunicated by the inquisitors, even to casting interdicts over whole communities. Those who suffer remain without redress, so that those who are able are led to take it into their own hands, for they can get it nowhere else. Justice is trampled underfoot. There is no alguazil who dares to make an arrest, or scrivener to draw up papers, so many have been slain or wounded for so doing, and the death of an alguazil is held at naught, as though the officers of justice were common enemies. If the king would re-establish the jurisdiction of the royal courts, there would be an end to the excommunications with which the inquisitors defend their delinquents, as though they were vessels of the temple. The time of the councils and of the king would not be consumed by these perpetual competencias, and the plagues would cease, wherewith God afflicts these kingdoms for the injustice, the violence, and the dissolute life of the people. These warnings and remonstrances fell on deaf ears. The Suprema was skilled to work upon the piety of the king, and to promise him relief from perils if he would placate God by increasing the privileges of the Inquisition, the very existence of which depended upon its ability to protect its familiars from the law and from the universal hatred in which they were held. End of Book 2, Chapter 4, Part 9. Recording by Shena Serre, Fresno, California.